Welcome back to Case of the Sunday Scaries. I'm Elyse.
And I'm Annie.
And by the time you hear this, you will be probably suffering a little bit of a hangover, a little bit tired, because you will have just rang in the new year. Thank God 2020 is done. On to a new chapter.
2020? It was 2022.
Well, you know what? 2020 wasn't great either. So thank God 2020 is over. Thank God 2021 and 22.
Thankful
I
for
can't
all the
believe I
20s.
said that. Maybe I'm a little more tired than I anticipated. But do you have any resolutions? Do you make resolutions?
I do, and they last me about 2 weeks. So this year I'm going no resolutions. I'm just trying to be a good person.
And you already are a good person.
I could always be better.
It's always nice that when you can accomplish your resolution on day one of the new year, I
Check.
guess.
What about you?
I'm not a big resolution person. We did it growing up. Like my family would do it, and then we would write it down and look at it the following year.
I love that.
It was a cute little tradition, but usually I wasn't checking anything off. So I'm not a big resolution person. I guess I could try yours. I'll try to be a good person this year. Well, we are starting off the new year and this episode a little bit differently. I wanted to start off today's episode by giving you a little heads up. Annie and I talked about it, and I recently heard a story that I wanted to cover, and it's the story of a beautiful girl named Molly McLaren who was taken from this world far too early. However, as I began doing this research for this case, I felt like I would possibly be doing a disservice by not opening myself up to our listeners and sharing a bit of my story and what connected me so much to Molly's case. So like I said, Annie and I discussed it, and I've decided to start this year off with a little bit different of an episode. And we're doing a little bit of a mini-series talking about abusive relationships, but perhaps not the abuse that immediately comes to mind, that of a battered spouse, someone where you can see bruises, cuts, injuries, but a mini-series talking about high-control emotional abusive relationships and stalking. I believe this will be in 3 parts. First, I'm going to be sharing parts of my story, then discussing Molly's case, and then speaking with a professional that can provide better understanding and resources if anyone else finds themselves or someone they love in a situation like this. Please, guys, know my intention through this series is not to deter anyone from getting the help that they so deserve. But I hope perhaps even if no one else in your life seems to understand, that listening to this might make you feel less alone and maybe be emboldened by these stories to come up with a safety plan for removing yourself from that relationship and getting a support team around you to help you on your path to recovery. This is going to be probably the most emotional one for me. This isn't something that I normally talk about, but just wanted to let you guys know I am changing the name in this story to protect myself, obviously. But I've also left out parts that too heavily involve other people or that I'm not really ready to share in a public way, because this is nerve-wracking as it is.
Of course. And thank you for being vulnerable with us, because I know it's scary, but we never know who just needs to hear this little story to realize they're not alone and to maybe just feel like they have someone in their corner, because we are always in our listeners' corner. We have your back. Even if we can't meet you in person, we have your back.
Thanks. I wish we were in person for this one, but poor Annie is under the weather a little bit. So we are doing this one remotely just so that I don't get sick either. Keep your cooties to yourself.
You've had a rough 2022.
Exactly. Well, you've heard us talk on this podcast about how the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship can be when they're leaving it. And that was certainly the case for me. I met my ex, John, almost 13 years ago. He came to a New Year's Eve party that I was hosting at a hotel, and even though I had a date, I mean, he wasn't that much of a date. He was just there to, a little arm candy. There was an instant attraction when he walked in. I will admit, I was fairly young, 22, I believe, but I think I had been through some things in younger years that had exposed me to the world not being so rosy as I believed it to be as a child, but in many ways I was still very sheltered, just because of the geographical area I grew up in and spent most of my young 20s. I had just recently moved to a new city, and this man who showed up with such a presence was an instant draw. He was beautiful. He was, well, quite frankly, the quintessential bad boy. Tattoos, big muscles, very aloof, and my 22-year-old self wanted everything to do with it.
We always want the bad boys at that age.
Always. I mean, what is that? We need a psychologist to come on and tell us why that is.
It's because our frontal lobe isn't quite developed. So we see danger and we're like, we can totally fix them. Or they're going to be a great time. Either way.
Well, lesson learned. My date for the evening had enjoyed the open bar a little bit too much, so I left the night early to escort his wobbly ass back to the hotel room. And I remember getting back to the room and my phone buzzing with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Come back out. This is John. It was all very fast from there. The first date, I remember recognizing something in our conversation that struck me as different. He had told me prior that he wasn't good enough for me, that we shouldn't even go on a date. And my God, I really wish I had listened to him then. But what seemed different to me that first date was how vulnerable and exposed he seemed. I had the sense that this was a totally different side of John than the world knew. That this man who had such a tough exterior, who doors seemed to open for, who people paid attention to, was showing just me who he really was, and that was intoxicating. Our relationship started hot and heavy, but there was always this undercurrent, this feeling that it was too intense, too much. I wrote a lot of this off. He was passionate. We were falling in love. And oh, that so present feeling of it's us against the world. What I didn't realize was that it felt like us against the world because my world was quickly becoming smaller and smaller. I was being systematically trained to pick him over my friends, over family. And I remember a time that a little flicker of this isn't right hit me when we were out and about one night and someone he knew came up and talked to me. It was a male. There was no flirtation. I think we were discussing that his Russian heritage, and I told him something silly about the only thing I knew about Russian heritage, which was growing up in Alaska, and that my town was named after the Russian word for soldier.
Innocent conversation.
I would say so. I don't think many great relationships talk about, like, well, guess where I grew up? It's the Russian. Yeah, no, there was no flirting going on, and it was not even riveting conversation. But John didn't like it. My focus had wavered from him. So, very embarrassingly, in front of our friends and strangers, he began yelling at me, calling me derogatory names. And then, as I cried in front of him, there was just something different in his eyes. I to this day can't explain it, but it was like watching my emotional reaction to him pleased him. There was a smile behind his fury. As is the patterns in many high control relationships, after a bad incident, he would be my knight in shining armor, doting over me, showing me his quote unquote love and grand gestures, one of which surprising me when he came over with a tattoo of my name just 2 months into the relationship.
That is so permanent. Like, that's the word I think of. That is permanent AF.
It was very permanent, but it was always like, it's us, babe. Like, we had a fight. Everything's going to be fine. He was the one that would bring me heating pads and soup when I had cramps, took me on very elaborate dates. And honestly, for a while, most of my friends and coworkers were jealous. Here was this guy surprising me with lunch, bringing it all the way to work nearly an hour from where he lived, always putting on his best smile and doing all the grand gestures, even telling my employer, still not quite sure how he coordinated this, that I needed certain days off because he'd be planning a surprise romantic trip for us. He included a lot of outside people in the relationship that seemed, well, I guess at the time, I guess it seemed romantic, but thanks to the power of hindsight and therapy, I can see now it was a way to get people on his side when he would need it.
Question.
Answer.
Whenever he was doing all of this, were your friends and coworkers and maybe even family, like, did they like him? Were they like, oh my gosh, Elyse, you have such a catch? Or were they sensing something was off?
My family was in Alaska, so there was already a little bit of that vulnerability there because I was far away from them. So you always kind of edit what you tell your family, right? You're not going to call with every fight, with every thing. They knew I was seeing someone. I'm certainly not going to tell my dad that he got a tattoo of me 2 months into the relationship because he'd be
No.
like, what?
He's like, I'm getting on a flight. I'll be right there.
Yeah, but it was always, I'll send them pictures of us going to baseball games and doing all these fun things. So I think they had a very limited view of what was going on. And like I said, this is only a few months into the relationship. And at this point, at least in my opinion, he was still trying to build up this facade to get people on his side. So he would be very well behaved in front of people unless it was kind of like his people, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. If we were
Mm-hmm.
out and it was mainly his friends, that's when like more public incidents would happen. But it'd always be followed up by these romantic gestures or, oh God, you know those couples on Instagram that you're like, they can't be that good. They're always just like lovey dovey.
Oh,
That
yeah.
was him. Every post was about me. Every like, I love my girl. I love this. And then he'd get mad and they'd all disappear. I actually forgot about that because it was kind of annoying to me at the time, to be
Right.
honest.
And back then, we couldn't archive posts. You had to delete it for good. Like, it was
Yeah.
gone forever.
I'm like, okay, we all get the point. So it was, to me, it was a good show that he was putting on. But behind the scenes, things were starting to escalate. So, like I said, he had all these people on his side. He was doing all these grand gestures. And if I were to reach out to someone about our fights, perhaps they would choose his side. Well, but Elise, like, just, this is just a bump in the road. And this is no fault to them. He was a master in his craft for a while.
Well, he's kind of giving them the highlight reel, the golden parts of the relationship where people maybe would have a hard time seeing those negative sides of him because to them, they only know the positive side and the happy John and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And honestly, a lot of it was easy to forgive at first. Look how bad he felt. I could blame it on the night out. Maybe he had one too many cocktails. He didn't mean it. And after a while, the grand gestures would stop, and again, I'd be the focus of his anger. I want to be clear here, the abuse started out as verbal and controlling, but during the course of the relationship, he was not physically violent. There was times after where we're going to talk about some physically threatening things, yes, but I'm sharing this story because it doesn't always start out as morally inexcusable behaviors like violence. It can often just begin with little things. Things can seemingly run below the surface, easily forgiven, easily excused, but also easily escalated. John and I had gone through a very, very rough patch. Honestly, while I was writing this down and kind of making a timeline of the relationship, I could not for the life of me remember what this fight was even about, but I know that things were ramping up. There were feelings on my end that I needed to end this, a sense of constant dread for the next shoe to drop. He had put on a great front to my friends, to my family, but my world had grown so small. Despite his best attempts to put on the boyfriend of the year face, his mask had started to fall one too many times, and people just didn't want to be around it. And by connection, around me. I had less people I felt I could confide in. They were probably honestly sick of hearing about it, and I don't blame them, because time and time again, I would always choose John.
So you're 22, you're in a new city. How long had you lived there for?
Let's see. I moved out there only a year because I moved out right after my 21st birthday and met him New Year's when I was 22.
So you're looking for friendships, you're seeking relationships, maybe not a romantic one, but just people to be around because you're young, you're going out, having fun. So yeah, that'd be a really hard thing, I think, to start realizing that your circle's getting smaller. You have this one person who you know is kind of causing it, but I don't know if you ever loved him, but maybe you still, you see the good in him. He has those good moments you said.
Oh, I absolutely loved him. There's no question about that. Was it healthy love? Was it mutually beneficial love? No. Um, but I wouldn't have excused as much as I did if I didn't feel strongly. And that's what I want people to understand is that it's so easy from the outside looking in to be like, well, why wouldn't they just leave? And it's like, because these people are so good at manipulating the situation. And you feel like truly it is us against the world. It's very easy as your world gets smaller to believe what they're telling you is true.
Yeah. I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't start a relationship with him knowing what it would have been, but you wouldn't fall for it or put up with it if there wasn't all these good times and these like extravagant things. And I don't mean I was looking for money. It was not about that. It was just this like whirlwind romance. It was easy to get caught up in the fairy tale that he was bullshitting me on.
It was that feeling that we all seek our whole life, that feeling of love and lust and just happiness. And he gave you that in small quantities, it sounds like.
Right. This is where I should probably mention again, this was only a few months into our relationship. We had met on New Year's Eve, and by the first week of April, it was time for perhaps the biggest grand gesture of all. He told me I needed to pack a bag for the weekend, that he had arranged it all, again, arranging it with my work, who had all fallen for his crap, and that we were going to be going away, and that we were going to reconnect. Everything would be fine. I knew he had spoken to my dad in the past, telling about his plans for our future. My dad and him never got an opportunity to meet, but they did talk on the phone. We spent a few hours driving down the road. Where we were headed, I had no idea, as was normally the custom. We arrived in a small town into a cabin in the woods. Well, now I sound like I'm about to tell you a really tragic story.
I know. I'm like, cabin in the woods, small town. Okay, where are we going?
But the first couple nights were really good. We tried our hand at charcoal grilling before giving up very quickly and going into town for dinners. We drank probably a little too much wine, played card games. It was actually peaceful. I could almost believe that removed from the world that we knew, the people around us, maybe it could be this easy. And that's one thing that as friends started to change and my relationships changed. It was always, it's their fault. It's their fault. They did this and they instigated this. And, there was just never any responsibility. After a few days where everything, like I said, seemed like he was telling the truth, things were going to get back on track. We went for a hike up to this waterfall, and I remember him acting sort of shifty on the hike, quieter than normal, and that's when I knew something was brewing. What I didn't expect was for him to pull over on our way back to the cabin from the trailhead, looking over a large scenic view, and for him to drop to his knee and propose.
I was going to say this sounds like a proposal setup. Oh my gosh.
4 months into a relationship.
Oh, I mean, he got your name tattooed. He moves quick. He had
He
the
does.
tattoo.
At this
He
point,
has the
I think he had
proposal.
about 3 tattoos of me.
Wow.
Or no, I guess the other one happened after we got engaged. But yeah, there was a lot of tattoos. Tattoos and engagement rings.
Tattoos and bad moods.
Yeah, that's what we should name this episode. So this is what I was supposed to dream about as a little girl, the fairy tale, the happy ending. I mean, we all want that proposal story, right? For Christ's sakes, I was on a show called The Bachelor where you get
Right.
proposed to. Like, I want that fairy tale. But you know what my thought was that day? The thought that I would never tell him. I wasn't excited for my future with him or the family we might have. I was excited that if he proposed and I accepted, he would know how committed I was to him. And maybe then, this would all stop.
Like you're constantly playing defense. Did you ever just take a breath and have that sense of, or were you always just, I feel like I'm tense right now listening to this story. I can't imagine actually living it.
Yeah, I mean, he was very good at when he was good. And you hear people say things like, when he was good, he was great. He was. He was absolutely the most attentive, the most patient, sweet as pie, but it only lasted for a certain time. So as soon as you took that breath, you'd already done something to make him mad again.
Talk about walking on eggshells.
Yeah. And that's not what should be going through your mind when someone proposes to you is if I say no, what are the consequences? And if I say yes, then maybe he'll finally realize that I'm committed to him and I won't have to worry about these jealous outbursts or those just should not be going through your mind when you get proposed to.
No, it should be like, what's my dress going to look like? And who's going to be my maid of honor? And what color flowers are we going to have? Like the fun things, especially at 22, you should not be worried about that. And sadly, you were. Which I want to hug you.
Air
I
hug.
don't want to get you sick.
So it didn't stop. The isolation became even more present. On another orchestrated trip where I'm sure he had, we'd gotten a blow up fight, so off to the Virgin Islands we went, I realized that the only time I could pacify his anger is if my sole focus was on him. If I smiled, did as I was told, gave myself to him without hesitation, body, soul, mind, everything, his anger would be quieted. One night while we were having a nightcap on our hotel balcony, because God forbid we go down and join in the fun and festivities of the, like an all inclusive hotel, they'll have like fun little nights and activities.
Oh, yeah. You make some friends, those friends that you come back to the States and you still talk to because it's like a vacation friend. Absolutely.
That was too scary for me to do because God forbid, like they get pulled into any of this or he thinks I'm flirting with someone. So I made the choice like, oh, well, I'm tired. Let's just have drinks on our patio. We can still listen to the music because then I was alone and he wouldn't be mad at me, or so I thought. He left to go get ice and he must have forgotten a key. But as the music bumped below our room and cocktail in hand, and I could take a breath without his ever weighted presence in the room, I must not have heard him knock at the door. And it was only a matter of probably 5 minutes at the very most when he had gone to get ice, come back, must have knocked on the door. I didn't hear him because I was sitting out on the patio, and gone to get, a replacement key from the hotel. 5 minutes tops. Next thing I know, he is barging in, screaming. It was just a very bad and very scary scenario. And where did I sleep that night, Annie?
Don't tell me on the balcony.
I wish I'd slept on the balcony. I found a hammock on the beach in the
Oh,
middle of a different freaking country because I had not remembered to I don't know. I didn't know that he didn't have a key card with him, but I had ignored him and his words.
the fact that you felt safer on a beach in a different country versus sleeping next to the person that you're engaged with.
Well, I didn't have an option. He kicked me out of the room.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Awful.
It wasn't until fall of that same year that stranded on a busy city interstate overpass after being kicked out of his car for some fight that I knew this needed to be over. I had grown up around men that protected their partners. They would rather get themselves hurt than put their partner in danger. And here I was on a roadway with no walking path, with cars zooming past me at 75 miles an hour. This was not love. I remember texting my dad asking him to not let me go back to John, that if I ever thought about it, to remind me of this moment. I don't think I ever told my dad what had happened. I just told him I needed to be done. My parents may not have been privy to everything going on, but I think they knew at this point something wasn't right. I steeled myself, and when John came back around in the car, I got in and didn't say a word until I got to work. I didn't even shed a tear until John pulled away. I am so grateful to whatever allowed the blinders to finally be removed that day. When there had been so many times where his presence had become one of the most emotionally and sometimes physically unsafe places to be. I don't remember now who said this, but I remember this saying, if you wouldn't want it for your children, why would you accept it for yourself? And that just kept playing in my head. And after a very tearful conversation with my employer, I found the strength sitting in our break room to tell John it was over. I always say this every episode, and now I'm saying about my own story. I wish that this is where the story ended. But of course it isn't, because hi, we're on this podcast.
Right.
This is the part of the story that I want to be extremely cautious of what I share, but things dramatically escalated from here in a very dangerous and painful way. John started sending me very troublesome messages all hours of the night, calling, begging, apologizing, just to explode again when he didn't get the answers he wanted. Threatening messages about my safety, about destroying me, sometimes cryptic and sometimes outwardly descriptive messages about how I would come to an end, came from numbers I didn't recognize. I would later find out these were from prepaid, or we call them burner phones, or apps that would change the number from where calls were coming from. I think Annie even talked about this app in a previous
WhatsApp.
episode.
Is that it?
No, not WhatsApp. There was an app years back. I don't even know if they still have it. They shouldn't. It should be illegal. Where you can just type in any phone number and it will look like it's coming from that person's.
And you still get it to your phone.
Right.
Yeah, I can't remember, but I know what you're talking about.
My sister was the first one to find out that he had a record, that in a previous relationship he had charges against him, but that it had been dismissed. The only thing I can thank John for is my armchair detective skills, because I started digging, and the multitude of lies he had told, the facade that was John's life, came crumbling down very quickly. His job, a lie. Those doors that are always seemingly opening to him was because he had ties to some shady characters and drug business. Everything came into question, and I got to work digging into him and making my own calls. Through my research, it became clear that the person I had been spending my nights and days with was a desperate man who had created an imaginary life, and I was the main character in this fantasy. And all those lies were starting to crumble around him, and I was possibly in a more dangerous situation than I could have ever realized. When you have nothing to lose anymore, what stops you from doing any number of things that he threatened me with? I was always aware of John's presence, whether it was him revving his motorcycle outside my door multiple times in the middle of the night repeatedly, leaving a cigarette. He smoked good old Camel Crushes, and in the morning, I would find a still burning butt of one on my patio steps. Pictures or descriptions of how I looked that day at work being sent to me from these other mysterious numbers. He was seemingly everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. Everything came to a head when one night he came into my home. I was there, but in a moment of panic chose to leave the house instead of dealing with the confrontation, and he went in and removed property that he had given me during the course of our relationship, including a laptop. Now, I tried to describe this when I was telling Annie about it, that there was a suggestive photo on this laptop. By today's standards, I don't think it would be considered that.
By today's standards, you're like fully clothed and a nun, basically.
Right, but it was something that to me was intimate. It was taken for him. It was supposed to be cute while we were on a trip to Vegas, be a little suggestive, but it certainly wasn't something I ever wanted to be public. Well, that photo was stored on that computer, and suddenly this was his profile photo on Facebook. Posts were being made about me with these pictures, my place of employment, that at this point was aware of how bad things had gotten. He sent them an email from my email address, resigning me from my job. My roommate's girlfriend was going through her law school program, and she convinced me I needed to do something before things got worse. There's gonna be a lot of pauses in this. Sorry, I'm like just trying to remind myself to breathe.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
I went and filed a temporary restraining order, and once they heard the scope of what was going on, they granted it and tacked on some criminal charges on top of it. I wish I could say I felt protected, but in the end, a restraining order, what do we always say? It is just a piece of paper. And I don't want to sway someone from not getting one. This is a very important step to document a history of issues. Yes, it can feel like just a piece of paper. Please, I want to encourage you, annoy the police, annoy the DA assigned to your case if it ever escalates to the point of criminal charges. Document everything and create safety measures if you think your phone or computer are being watched. It's so easy to say, like, oh, this won't happen to me, but you never know.
How did you get them to listen to you? Because we've all seen everything from movies to like documentaries where they go, a woman goes and she's begging for help and they're kind of dismissing her. So what did you do differently?
I don't think it's about different. One, I'm privileged because I am a white woman who had no criminal history whatsoever. So it couldn't be tacked onto like, oh, these are, just some drunks or some druggies or whatever. So I had the privilege of my skin tone, one. I also had the privilege of that I had never gotten into trouble at that point, and he had a record. So
Got
that was
it.
helpful. Even though the charges were dismissed, they were still on his record, if that makes sense. They hadn't been expunged, so they could see that. I will say, I think more could have been done and should have been done at certain times, which is why I'm saying annoy the cops, annoy the DA. If you have a restraining order and someone's around you, call them. Like, who cares if you annoy them? Because everything that they go to, they have to have a report on. Just document everything. I probably was not very well liked because it was happening so often and in so many different ways that I was sending the DA messages, emails every day of just screenshots of text messages, the different phone numbers, all of it. And who cares? That is
Right.
literally their job. Who cares? Like Annie and I were talking about, I often felt like I was annoying them. Even though these people were put into place to protect me, every time I notified them of him violating the restraining order, it seemed like nothing happened. Just because I was not showing up to the station or hospital covered in physical bruises, but I was scared. I had lost my job. I was staying with friends leading up to the court case because my roommates, rightfully so, did not feel safe having me in their home anymore, and I was receiving threats numerous times a day. I'm not going to go into too much detail of where things escalated from there because that's about what I'm comfortable sharing it right now, but it was an incredibly scary time. On the day I was set to testify, I showed up in court, but John had hired a lawyer a day before court, and rightfully so, for the lawyer's sake. He asked for a continuance to review the case. I left feeling so defeated that day. I had spent days, weeks, basically in hiding, saying like, okay, I'm going to show up so that no one else is going to go through this, just to walk out of that courthouse. And I remember asking the judge and DA to please just hold him there for a few minutes so I could have a head start.
That
Whew.
is terrifying. You had so much on your shoulders. I mean, the fact that you were even thinking about his future relationships and you were trying to put a stop to it right here, and for your own safety to ask the judge just for a few minutes.
Yeah, that shouldn't be the case. You should not be asking a judge for a head start so that you can get away from the person that has spent God knows how many months at this point terrorizing your life. And, I thought I was isolated before. You're going to feel real isolated when you lose your job, you lose your place of living because you're having to go into hiding and you can't show up at work anymore. They don't feel safe having you there, which I understand on all these people's feelings about. It makes perfect sense, but It was not a great time. And now I'm going to take a big exhale. I wish I could say the next time court rolled around that I was there, standing proudly while finally he was going to be held accountable. But I had already lost everything at that point, and I felt like I was no longer safe in this city. Not to mention, my family had recently found out about my pregnant sister's cancer diagnosis, and frankly, there was a lot of guilt and mixed feelings about me taking attention away from her with all the need and attention I was asking for, with the numerous calls to my parents daily to update them on John's recent antics. So when the next hearing rolled around, I was on a train leaving the city for good, which when I wrote that, I was like, wow, that sounds actually quite nice and romantic, but that is not the feeling I had when I was leaving. And over the years, I've heard from him every once in a while. When he got into a new relationship, I did have contact with the girl. I tried to warn her, and she, of course, didn't believe me at first. Who would? I get that. I sound like, the paranoid ex. Until the facade started coming down. I heard from him as recently as last year and just shake my head. Now, 13 years later, I feel sorry for him. I don't fear him anymore, and I still have anger for the emotional scars he has left. You guys can probably hear it in my voice. This is not fun for me to talk about. And I know that a lot of those scars and triggers will probably always remain. It's amazing how the body holds those memories. But thankfully, I had a loving family and got really great support through therapy. And now I'm here talking to you all, to our amazing podcast listeners, because it's sharing my story makes someone feel less alone. If it makes someone out there listening to this recognize similar patterns in their partner's behavior, if it convinces just one person that they aren't crazy despite what their partner has you believing, then you can and deserve to leave before things escalate. If that affects one person, then my desire for this podcast has been met. Annie and I talk about true crime here with a little paranormal and redhead history mixed in. But our desire for this podcast and sharing these stories has never been just to entertain you or to bring some weird reverence for people that do horrible things to others, but to share the victims' stories, to get the word out about missing people. Well, in Annie's case, because those make me too sad. And to hopefully be more aware of the world around you, the dangers of it just as much as the joys, and to gain a better understanding of mental health, and in some instances, to have interviews that give you guided help about these topics. So listeners, Scary Squad, thank you for letting me share a part of my story. I want you to know that abuse is abuse, period, and you deserve a safe and healthy relationship where you are cherished for being your wonderful, spooky ooky, crazy, unique selves. But if you find yourself resonating with anything we talked about today, please check out thehotline.org or call or text 800-799-SAFE. Oh, that's a heavy one to start the new year off with, but I think for anyone listening to this, I'm 13 years removed. You can hear how much it impacts me, but I think that this series was important for me to do, to share my story, to share Molly's story next week, and then have someone come on, because as much as we talk about domestic abuse in this podcast, you often don't hear the stories about harassment and stalking and how quickly those can escalate. Because like you said, it's hard for people to take you as seriously when you don't show up with a rib broken or a black eye. These are wounds that stay under the surface for a very long time.
I don't have anything to say other than thank you for sharing your story. I'm looking forward to this mini series, not looking forward to hearing the pain, but to having our listeners hear it, because you said it perfectly. We had a mission when starting this podcast: always highlight the victims, talk about the cases that are hard to talk about. And this is one of them. So I love you. I'm sad.
I love you too.
I'm emotional.
I'm not really sure how to wrap that one up. So I'm just going to say this series is not going to come like one part, two part. We are going to space it out a little bit. So Annie will be back next week. But as always, until then.